Hi, I'm Arthur, and this is part 18 in a 20-part series about the Primarchs, covering a more in-depth look at them, giving my opinion, as well as cracking a few jokes along the way. Do you need to have seen the other parts to understand this one? No, but it would make me happy. Part 18 means we are talking about one of the Primarchs I find gets written off a lot. Corvus Corax is often regarded, at least in the circles I frequent, as the Primarch that just turned into a demon. That's kind of all we know, and that's kind of all people bring up. To be fair, I was one of those guys, and to go even further, I think I genuinely fumbled the bag in my first Raven Guard video, as I think I didn't cover them to a degree that I think is acceptable. But with Corvus, I kind of want to rectify this and see if I can give you the make of the man, the sum total of who he is and why he is the way he is. I'm gonna be real with you. He's probably in my top 5 favorite Primarchs right now after doing all my research on him. So I'm not going to mince words. Let's get into the early life of Corvus Corax and discuss how he ended up being the way he is. Am I being vague about everything I'm going to be discussing at this point? Yes, I am. The funny Birdman is naturally a pretty vague person, and I want to portray him in a way that makes sense. And before we get into it, let's sell some gamer subs, shall we? You want to know something insane? I actually finally quit drinking soda and energy drinks recently, which might not seem like much, but I am hopelessly addicted to most stimulants as well as drinks with a sugar content that would kill our less pancreatically inclined individuals. It was not easy, so I could switch to something like fruit juice, but if I don't have a caffeine content of over 400 milligrams coursing through my system by noon, I'm actually going to suffer brain death. Little known fact. So instead of taking the next logical step and riding the white-nosed pony into the sun like any other self-respecting YouTuber, I leaned more into gamer subs. Their endless shipments to my house have done nothing but improve my steadily worsening caffeine addiction. So I think it's time you hop on this ride with me. Apes together strong and all that. My current blend of choice is 1 scoop of good and 1 scoop of sweet 6-pack. It's fruity, tart, and incredibly sweet, while also being caffeinated enough to at least get my heart pumping. So if you want to pick yourself up some gamer subs, I would highly recommend those two, if any. Use my link in the description, as well as use code BONEZONE at checkout to get 10% off all purchases. You'll also be supporting the channel this way, so yeah, thanks again to GamerSups for supporting this channel. And let's get into a talk about cladistics? Okay. Tangy juice conversations aside, let's get into Corvus. Number 19, the Pale Child, the Raven Lord. His weird landing on one of the shittier planets in 40k, Lycaeus, a large moon that hovers around another planet by the name of Kievar. It was kind of known for one thing, slavery. Yeah, it was basically maybe one step above New Syria in terms of personal satisfaction, because at least here you die for a marginal purpose, which is, mining, unlike on New Syria where you just die for the entertainment of rich people. Yeah, it was a slave colony of miners who were forced day in and day out to work until they dropped or were allowed to stop for a short period of time to maybe get some food and water. There is this fun little moment as Corvus was being raised. He was discovered by these miners and seen as kind of a savior figure, this mythological entity that was going to remove them from slavery, and he was protected his entire life. But there was this moment when he was growing up that the prison guards who were going to basically search for anything that was out of the ordinary in this colony, they found that there were some weird hidings that were going on throughout the mine, and they were trying to find out what was responsible for this. So they found that these were basically small hiding places for Corvus Corax, and they found Corvus Corax, or at least they think they did. See, Corvus was hiding. He wasn't fully grown at this point in a small cavern. He was in plain sight, and this is where we find out that Corvus has a weird Primarch power. Now, from a reductionist standpoint, I could just describe it as he turns invisible, but that's not really what happens. See, the people who walked in could not see Corvus Corax, and that is because Corvus can remove himself from your perception, which is different from being invisible in a few minute ways, because he can make it so that you don't hear him, you cannot see him, but he's still there. So he's picked up by cameras and automata and all that because they don't have brains and organic senses that can be manipulated. But he himself can basically make it so that you can't even perceive his power armor, his existence, and so on. And with that being said, I know it's a bit pedantic, but there is a very fun distinction here, and it does lead to some very interesting situations. Like, apparently in lore, it's genuinely horrifying to go up against him because you could just be be on patrol with your little goon squad, and suddenly a dude explodes into gory chunks as Corvus Corax is ripping them to pieces. It's actually a pretty grisly mental image, but I'm getting off track here. So using this ability, as well as the hit-and-run tactics he had mastered from knowing that he had it, he began teaching these kinds of methods to the other individuals in the mines of Lycaeus. He managed to take back the moon itself from the slavers that had owned it, only to find out a lot about the location itself. Like, the mining colony itself was used to gather resources for the planet of Kievar that the moon was rotating around. See, on Kievar, the main governing body were the tech guilds. This massive, I guess, meritocracy. It's basically just like an anarcho-capitalist society where if you have the most money, you basically take over the world type deal. So there really isn't any rules or laws outside of just, I have more money, therefore I am right, which is horrible, and these are the people that Corvus kind of hates the most, actually. So once he found out all that, this was kind of the weirdest timing ever, but this is when the Emperor, of all people, just appears to tell Corvus, hey, I'm your dad, you're a Primarch, you're going to lead massive legions of troops, but I'm just going to let you wrap up here and give you time to kind of finish your business, which is kind of a smidge out of character for the Emperor, considering that whole Mortarian fiasco, but you know what, it's fine. With Lycaeus now being liberated entirely and being renamed to Deliverance, Corvus found that there was this massive cache of nuclear projectiles, and he was caught between decisions. Do we nuke the planet below, Kievar, kill thousands, or do we go on a ground assault and kill only those that deserved it? Weirdly enough, he said fuck it and nuked the living shit out of Kievar, which, as a reminder, was the planet Deliverance was rotating around and had civilians on it. And I think that that's kind of an interesting decision because it shows the character of Corvus. Now, he could have gone the peaceful route, but I think it shows that his character isn't 100% the Vulcan, I do everything the right way. No, he understands the importance of symbols as well as the importance of showing that he is willing to make the hard decisions to the people down there that are thinking that they can get away with shit. So he wanted to destroy the tech guilds on Kievar so that they could, do away with that whole slavery malarkey. These fat cats were the kind of thing that Corvus stood against most. See, growing up as a slave, he has seen his friends and family be beaten and whipped his entire life, and he grew to resent people who lorded their power over individuals, but he especially hated people who did it for no reason other than their own greed. He absolutely despised people who basically subjugated others just for the sake of power and nothing else. So it's kind of one of the reasons why, in a vindictive streak, he ended up nuking Kievar and kind of bringing everything into compliance. Now, once he nuked Kievar, cowed the tech guilds into compliance, he was then brought into the folds of the Imperium, which leads to a very interesting interaction involving his legion that he was meeting. See, Corvus Corax is a very humble Primarch, but he sticks to his ideals. And when I say he's very humble for a Primarch, which still means that he's going to pull rank whenever he wants to. But in terms of combining legions with their Primarchs, we always tend to talk about the cruel ones, the weird ones, the rough ones that kind of happen that are kind of a big pop, like Angron murdering every single one of his sons until Karn showed up and talked to him, or Perturabo showing up and just asking for them to decimate themselves. But Corvus actually did basically the same thing, but a little worse in terms of percentages, but the intent is kind of what shows the difference between the two camps. Say, the original Raven Guard, the legion that was born from Terran stock, were actually all tyrants. Well, not all tyrants, but they were pretty much completely occupied by individuals whom had this obsession to sow hopelessness. Similar to that of how the Night Lords operated, where they wanted to sow fear, and using whatever methods they could, they did so. They used cruelty as like a main weapon. With the Raven Guard, the big distinction between them and the Night Lords of the time was the end goal wasn't fear, the end goal was cruelty. It was to make the opponent feel as hopeless and like they could do nothing as humanly possible. And they tended to delight in that kind of cruelty. So they had kind of a tyrannical approach to individual bouts of war. So Corvus, seeing all of this, took it as basically an affront to everything that he believed in. He believed in the freedom of others. He hated tyrants. So I basically just took about like 80 to 90% of the Legion and just told them to fuck off and die somewhere. I'm not kidding. He basically separated most of the Terran Marines and sent them off on missions that he didn't have to govern over, where he was just hoping that they would die. So he ended up replacing the majority of the individuals in the Raven Guard with the ones from Deliverance who grew up in the slave pits with him. So with Corvus in charge, he had to kind of have his preferences be implemented in a bit of an odd way. He basically made it so that the Raven Guard had a looser command structure. Sure, there were the standard Legion ranks, you know, captains, lieutenants, chapter masters, so on and so forth, but there was a larger degree, or at least larger than most, of freedom. The individuals who were in charge of certain areas of expertise, like, you know, your Moritats, your Praevians, your Centurions, and so on, these individuals were allowed to, you know, command over their specific fields, but everybody was allowed to speak up as if they were the same rank, and they weren't supposed to be reprimanded. Speak their mind type deal. And with Corvus, he wanted that to be the same with him. He wanted his Legion to feel like they could speak up to him no matter what. And for the most part, it did work out, though sometimes Corvus would pull rank if it meant getting his way, because we're going to find out later that he is a bit reckless in how he goes about things. In terms of comfort of being an individual, Corvus and his Legion are probably second only to the White Scars in terms of freedom. Hell, in the rulebooks for the Horus Heresy, because of how comfortable and cool the Raven Guard are to kind of be a member of, the only really defectors that you can play in terms of traitor Raven Guard were either A, the Terran-born legionaries, who were kind of jilted over the whole exiled on a death quest thing, which, okay, reasonable, or just random dudes who felt that Corvus Corax had abandoned Deliverance before he got the job done. As the tech guilds were still in power, they just had greatly diminished power, so they saw that Corvus abandoned them with the job half done. The relationship of Corvus and the Raven Guard is a lot like a father with his adult son, equals in all but experience, but at the end of the day, father kind of supersedes the son's desires, right? I'm gonna do a quick aside, because I don't really have a good spot to put this section in, but I'm just going to use it as a point to make a quick intermission, and we're going to talk about the fact that Corvus has a genetic curse, because I don't know how to make a good script that flows into this, so I'm just going to cut to that. We're going to talk about the Night Haunter and his relationship with Corvus Corax, which is one of the most interesting brotherly relationships of the Primarchs. You're going to have to trust me on this, but one second, I want to talk about the Sable Brand on this, like, brief intermission. Because I'm bad at making things flow well, and I don't want to interrupt my explanation of something a little bit later, I'm putting a bit of a pacing break here, because one, I edit things in 10 to 15 minute stretches, so it's easier for me to handle, and two, I don't know, I just wanted to kind of put a break in here, and also this allows me to put in some editor's notes after the fact once the video is pretty much done. The Sable Brand is one of the lesser known gene seed curses, and it's kind of important to know about. Basically, as I interpret it, your body's ability to process gene seed kicks into high gear for a short period of time, making you adopt the nature of the Primarch more closely, as well as gain more of his traits. Those that get afflicted by the Sable Brand have their eyes turn black, their skin turn paler, and their hair turn even darker. But outside of the physical afflictions, their sanity begins to fray just a little bit, as they get this sort of grim resolution that they need to kill. They have an inherent desire for violence so powerful that it often overrides their normal thoughts. There is also a certain level of hallucinations that begin to manifest, and they usually manifest as birds, the voices of dead comrades and enemies alike, and just a bunch of, emo shit. Probably the worst one, the big one, is they lose all sense of self-preservation, and even in some aspects believe that their death is what is best for those around them. Now, there is ways to cure the Sable Brand, but they are usually pretty esoteric. The flaw is likely genetic, but also probably psychic in nature, kind of like how Corvus is. As through sort of a solitary confinement mixed with meditation, some people can be relieved, and through intense combat, others. Combat tends to help the most, but it feels like once a debt has been paid and you've walked along the abyss's edge, that's the only time that you can truly come back from the Sable Brand. It's basically like a lesser version of the Black Rage, where the people affected become more berserk and more likely to commit acts of intense violence with a little bit of a boost to their sensory awareness, but they can actually be reversed. So with all that being said, the individuals afflicted were often put into this small subsection of undesirables known as shadow killers. Now, not all shadow killers were people with the Sable Brand. Some were just people from the original Legion that Corvus Corax didn't really want around, but I digress. These murderers were sent on missions that most men, even legionaries, would die from, and the killers themselves usually did too. But sometimes they didn't, and the ones that didn't came back from it with a higher chance of being cleansed of the Sable Brand. One of my favorite ways to explain this specific unit is during one of the books, I cannot quite remember which one, it was stated that on one particular mission there was a 40% survival rate for all of the legionaries involved, which for any other unit is considered an abysmal failure, but for the shadow killers it is considered a pretty decent success rate. But in the modern days, there have been practices put in place that allow the afflicted that carry the Sable Brand to be a bit more controlled. They're able to reduce the symptoms of the Sable Brand. So it very rarely manifests, but if the Sable Brand does manifest and it isn't cured after a long period of time, they are taken back to the Ravenspire and experimented on by the apothecaries of the chapter in secret in order to find further ways to cure it, or at least help those who are afflicted. Though personally, I think it's more of a psychic and mental thing than it is physical, so using apothecaries doesn't make as much sense as using, I don't know, a Space Marine therapist. I think you'll kind of come to the same conclusion I did with it and how it relates to Corvus Corax as we go further through his tale. You'll make the correlations that I think, but I just wanted to cover this right now so that you had that kind of context as to these individuals become more like Corvus Corax for a short period of time, much to their detriment. But now that that's out of the way, let's get back to the actual main video and, finish this shit. Okay, so with that out of the way, I can dive into the main topic here that I think would be important to discuss before I do my wrap-up, which is Corvus's relationship with the Night Haunter, aka Conrad Curse. From a top-down perspective, if you stripped them out of their armor and put them in the same clothing, you'd say they are pretty similar, almost twins, as they had very similar aspects, even similar traits. Both preferred stealth, hit and run, both were wildly passionate and feverishly obsessed with the concept of justice and its pursuit. They both had the desire for terror tactics, both had pale white skin, black eyes, and black hair, which I think is interesting. Their legions even operated in a similar way, but this is a point where I have to get super pretentious and ask a question. Are you guys familiar with the idea of convergent evolution? Yeah, so fun fact about me, I think I've mentioned it once in my entire video catalog, but I'm a university dropout. I was in university for 4 years for vertebrate paleontology, and even worked in the field for about a year towards the end as a research assistant. But one of my favorite topics was always, okay, this is going to be a mouthful, and I'm spelling it from memory, and it's not lining up no matter how I spell it in my little Word doc here, but it's called phylogenetic systematics. It is the study of the tree of life, the evolutionary branching points where one species can break off into a new one, creating a new species. You see it a lot in a lot of metaphors to discuss how things have evolved, but the tree itself is just to show how things evolve. It's a guide for the layman to understand. Divergent evolution is the process where things that have a common ancestor develop to cover a different niche. See, evolution is commonly misinterpreted as things evolve and get better with time, but no, you just get more specific to the location that you're in. So with divergent evolution, you can see things like in warmer climates you have elephants, and in colder climates you had mammoths. Both came from the same ancestor, but went in two different directions. Thus, they have similar traits that are becoming slightly different with time, thus diverging. But the process of speciation I want to talk about today and right now is called convergent evolution, which is the exact opposite, and it's one of the coolest ideas I've ever seen. Basically, it is the process where species evolve certain traits to occupy the same niche as other creatures that they are not even remotely related to. Don't understand? Okay, so let's make this easy and kind of point out a few things that makes my analogy a little bit more intuitive to understand. This right here is the skeleton of a raven's wing, and here is the skeleton of a bat's wing. Both of these perform the same task. They allow whatever they're attached to fly. And from a top-down perspective, you can look at that and say they're basically the same tool, as they're both wings that allow you to just fly. But both have reached this ability through completely different means of locomotion. Just by looking at the skeletal elements, you can tell that these are just from different animals and have evolved a different way and work completely differently. It just ends with them kind of doing the same thing. The difference between the bat and the raven is the same difference between Corvus Corax and Conrad Kurz. You might think, just by the outset, that they are basically the same, but when you get to the pedantic minutiae of their legions, their genetic curses, their abilities, well, you realize they're incredibly different. Where Corvus uses stealth to accomplish missions that are important to his legion, Kurz uses stealth to scare people, as he likes to scare people, as his main form of tactic. Where one sees justice paramount in order to build a society, and that to be righteous is more important than to be vengeful, the other sees punishment and retribution as the core foundations of justice and seeks it out through simply that, punishment. One sees fear tactics as the solution for compliance, and the other sees fear as the enemy of true peace. Understanding is the key feature to reconcile differences between people. Kurz is a pessimist who believes that the world itself is horrible. People are horrible and should never be trusted and treated as anything more than cattle. But Corvus is revealed to be so optimistic that he's often labeled as naive in the eyes of his brothers, for how often he trusts people that he shouldn't. Hell, this is the deep shit. I kind of glossed over the fact that even if you look at them like close up, they look genuinely different. Like Kurz's eyes, for example, they're not even black. Kurz's eye shape is naturally just like a normal pupil iris sclera, but because he grew up on Nostromo, his eyes adapted to the extreme dark, and because they adapted to the extreme dark, the iris of his eyes expanded so much that they almost are completely black. Corvus's eyes are actually completely black, and it's stated in lore that if Kurz was to give you a sidelong glance, it'd be one of the most unnerving things ever, because you could just see a little bit of white at the corners of his eyes, which I think is super interesting. They are just, through their weird-ass upbringings, ending up in kind of the same position. Stealth-loving warriors that ended up at the same point. Kurz, because he learned oppression was the only way that he could control the people of Nostromo, and Corvus because he lived his entire life in oppression as a slave of Lycaeus. It's actually a stated fact that Corvus was always worried about being compared or even referred to in the same way as Kurz, because he saw Kurz as, he probably should have, as a monster, but he never wanted to forget that justice, it's about putting a wrong right, not punishing someone so they are afraid of the punishment if they do it again. It's them genuinely learning and growing as people to be better. And it's stated that Kurz always envied Corvus for how his brothers looked at him. He saw Corvus as the better version of himself, which I think is cool as all hell. The narrative between the two scary boys is one of my favorite throughout the entire Horus Heresy. I wish they interacted more with each other, to be completely straight, and hell, I'd love to just have a full-out ground war between them and their legions. I think it'd be pretty damn neato. The closest we ever got was like Istvan 5, if I'm remembering correctly. But yeah, with all that being said, I kind of want to get into my closing points for Corvus Corax, but pointing out these comparison points is kind of interesting, as it's easy to understand his fears. He wants to pursue justice, but he doesn't want to come off as a tyrant. He doesn't want to reign his truth over other individuals like the slavers that owned him did. I want to discuss why he is such a powerful and fun Primarch in terms of just writing in a narrative sense. Before I do, I want to kind of mention the war gear of Corvus, as it's a bit of a very peculiar set of tools, as he has chosen the tools of an oppressor. See, as I mentioned, he's an incredibly optimistic and almost naive individual who tends to use symbols more often than not. So the tools he uses is an electrified whip and this metal gauntlet it's a lightning claw, which is kind of common to the Legion itself, but it's to show the iron grip of an oppressor and the lash of someone who is pushing those in front of him. Corvus wishes to be the oppressor of oppressors, because that is one of the biggest things about Corvus. He wants to lead by example and by symbol. I think he is one of the most pretentious of the Primarchs, but less in a fart-sniffing, oh ho ho, I'm the smartest guy in the room type of way like Magnus, and more the, I am making this AMV fight montage in my brain while I'm taking a shower, and when I get out I completely forget it. Like, he genuinely just thinks in 3 Days Grace lyrics, which I think is great. He is such an optimist that he thinks that, given the choice, everybody would always make the right choice if presented with something that he deems is the best option. And it's come to bite him in the ass in more occasion than once, but this kind of brings me to my closing points for Corvus Corax. Corvus is almost the perfect personification of the idea of noble optimism. He is one of these individuals who fights for what he believes in, even if it is going to embarrass him in the end if he messes up or even pursues it to its finality. It's something that I identify with a lot, because I myself tend to make horrible decisions just to stick to what I believe is my moral compass. And to say that I am a noble person would be such an overshoot. No, I go out of my way to cut in front of people at Burger King, and it's Burger King. Burger King sucks. But regardless, I'm a lot more boring than him, but on that sort of level of doing what you do because you believe it is right, even if it is going to embarrass you, is interesting to me. Maybe I'm just boring and love Hybrid Theory by Linkin Park a bit too much, but I kind of relate to Corvus a lot in his convictions as well as his ideals. But I will say, as I was reading about Corvus Corax, I was learning more about him as a persona and why I adored his personality, which is why I've kind of come to this conclusion that I find him more relatable than pretty much any of the other Primarchs. He's more down to earth. See, he has a track record of offering people the option of peace and to join compliance with the Imperium of Mankind, and obviously showing that this is the best option for their species and their culture, and then taking it weirdly personal when they should say no, to the point of even showing confusion on his end. Why would someone reject this offer in his mind? Why would the kind approach not work? And this kind of circles back to Kurz. Punishment does have its place in the Raven Guard, but he doesn't want it to be everything, and this is why I feel that the Sable Brand is such a fun curse for Corvus, as it represents the duality of his personality. See, when someone rejects his offer, it kind of drops the veil of that naive optimism that Corvus tends to manifest. And what is underneath is that sort of punishment, vengeance kind of personality. This persona that arrives that will not give up until an individual is dead that he deems worthy. The oppressor who oppresses other oppressors. A tyrant to tyrants. Thus, the Sable Brand itself manifests in such an interesting way in his Legion, because it's basically the same thing. If the only real way to fix it, for the most part, is either deep meditation on how it is and abstaining from combat, or going into the most intense combat that you could ever imagine. It's basically just kind of speedrunning how Corvus fixes a lot of the campaigns he's bungled. He has to go to battle himself and fight for what he believes in, or else slaughtering until it is done. It is this one-minded obsession with making sure the job is done that makes the Sable Brand, his idealism, his optimism, and his naivety kind of be manifested as a genetic curse. Hell, he once made a campaign last longer just because one guy he wanted to punish for his crimes escaped his initial assault, and thus Corax spent all of his attention looking for him instead of pushing forward with the war effort. Even his men from the Raven Guard told him this is a bad idea, and if you do this, you are going to set us back by like a year at least. But Corvus actually for once pulled rank and said, no, I'm the dad here, I'm taking this one, and actually ended up violently jettisoning this man into the sun. Slowly, I mind you, with the rest of his loyal retainers, recorded what their last words were, and then broadcast it to the rest of his empire, which, okay, that was pretty cursy of him, but, you know, the guy kind of deserved it. He basically released a non-Nurgle zombie plague that brain damaged everybody into being cannibals on his planet as a means for him just to escape. It's the kind of shit that even Kurz would be like, okay, that's a little It's a little too much. Corvus has a kind heart, tempered with a deep melancholy. He is probably one of the most balanced Primarchs. I would say even more so than, say, Guilliman, as Guilliman is often regarded as cold, humorless, and even a bit stony in expression. Corvus is passionate, can even crack a joke from time to time, and show a bit of mirth with his men, and is a bit easier to read than Guilliman most times. Corvus is probably the most human Primarch. He makes a lot of mistakes that often get his ass in trouble, but the part I think is the best about him is that he constantly tries to do better. He learns from his mistakes. He will always fight to make the universe better as a place to live in for humanity, even if that means that he shouldn't exist, which was something that kind of came up in his timeline. He realized that the universe's major problems at the time were caused by the existence of Primarchs and their legions. So he had this idea that once the entirety of the Horus Heresy was over, win or lose, he was going to destroy himself and his legion. He even tried to do so early. This also manifests in the Sable Brand, which causes passive, depressing urges that I feel like if I say that funny S word, I'm going to get a smack from YouTube, but you know what I mean here. But yeah, once everything was said and done, he actually, turned it around a little bit. But one of my favorite points in Corvus's story that shows his character was the birth of the Raptors. So, to kind of give you the short end of it, once his legion was decimated on Istvan V, as he was one of the members that was dropped there, the Emperor had trusted him enough to give him the key and the information to create new Space Marines. These were sort of the prototype for the prototypes of the Primaris Marines, because there's a lot of weird steps that came into making the Primaris Marines, but whatever. He was given the ability to make the genetic sequences as well as the tech that was hidden deep within the facilities to make these Space Marines. Now, what made them different was that they could be created within months rather than within years. And due to the way that they were created, they were adapted to fight at their maturity, even without any experience, and they were giving the veterans of the Raven Guard a hard time during combat drills. The first batch that came out had no problems, but it was what happened after that made them wrong. Basically, Alpha Legionaries, disguised as Raven Guard, sabotaged the facility and made it so that the Raptors that came out in the second batches and so on would basically be Chaos mutants that would ravage the gene seed of Corvus Corax, turning them into weird Chaos spawn bird monsters. They were barely sentient, which would only get worse with time, their bodies degrading as well as their minds. To a degree, these Marines were still useful as weapons against Chaos, as they listened to Corvus Corax as well as the other legionary members. But these were once people, robbed of their agency, their freedom, their ability to think, and to Corvus, they were prisoners of their bodies, shackled there by the tyrants of the traitor legions. There is a notorious scene at the end of the Horus Heresy, or at least close to it, where Corvus shows up to fulfill a promise and finds one of these mutants holed up in a cell. This individual could barely think or barely speak, its eyes deadened with no real major intellect in it. He walks over and comforts the creature as it was slack-jawed and drooling through its beak. It actually crawled up to him and kind of looked at him with this innocent glint in its eyes, similar to a young animal looking to its father. He found comfort in Corax's embrace, still genetically knowing that this was his Primarch, and this made Corax despair, as he made a promise that all warp-born monstrosities would die by his hand if he could help it, which these were tainted by the warp. And so while this creature was seeking warmth from its father, Corvus, in a swift motion, broke its neck, before going to the remaining hundreds that were still alive from the assault to defend the Imperial Palace, and did the same thing himself. Now, for pretty much any of the Loyalist Primarchs, having to do this would probably break them a bit, but for Corax to do this, it was the equivalent of asking Rabute Guilliman to misfile thousands of documents that would ruin the Imperium. Corvus Corax, mentally so, was unmade on that day, the same way that Leman Russ was unmade at the loss of his original battle brothers from Fenris. The same way that Jagatai Khan, once he had finally seen the end point of Horus's ambition, realized that he could no longer stay in this universe, he had to find his own battles. The same way Sanguinius felt when he realized he could not beat Horus Lupercal. he felt alone in a universe filled with enemies and locked himself away in the Raven Spire, which is one of the main locations for the Raven Guard, and meditated for a year to the day. He had learned the warp-based nature of the Primarchs and found out how to channel it, becoming something more than a Primarch but lesser in the same sense. A lot of people said that he became a Demon Prince, but that is stretching it a little bit. I think that there is a way to describe it as a Demon Prince, but in the same story, Lorgar confirms during their next meeting, as one of Lorgar's men from the Wordbearers pointed out, that their men were being destroyed by a rogue demon, and Lorgar just openly states that is not a demon. It was still something of the warp. How I like to think of it is it's an extension of his ability to hide from people and from the senses of people, where he can transform the perceptions of himself into whatever he deems fit, but this time whatever you see is actually going to be able to affect you physically. So he can make you hallucinate that there is a flock of birds tearing you to pieces, and you will be torn to pieces. But I also think that he's probably a bird monster of some sort that can turn into a flock of ravens. I think it's a little bit more esoteric than just a demon prince. Speaking of Lorgar, Corvus ended up spending the majority of his life afterwards hunting down the bald fuck. And since it's been about 9,000 years since we last saw the evil Mr. Clean himself, Corvus, King Birdman himself, is probably doing a pretty good job. Corvus is a man of rationale, kindness, justice, and a man of the people. But most of all, he's a man of freedom. An individual that would be pretty cool as fuck if he came back as a miniature, because a giant bird monster would be a fun miniature to have like a Marathi mechanic from AOS where he can transform back and forth. I doubt it would ever happen because it's a bit of a complicated thing to do. Regardless, what do you all think about Corvus Corax? I had a few other creators state that in the Horus Heresy, the Raven Guard bits are kind of the more boring parts, and in my experience so far, I haven't found that. I've been finding them pretty fun. But let me know in the comments what you think. Next time, we talk about Alfarius, and then we have something particularly weird after that. So let me know what you guess it's going to be for part 20 of this series. Special thanks to my channel members for supporting me. With your help, I am able to do this as a job for the foreseeable future, and I wouldn't want to do anything else. If you want to support my content, as well as gain access to some pretty fun perks, then become a channel member today. Thanks once again for watching, and before I go, I will say, I was trying that entire time to not give him shit for all the bird puns, but man, Corvus Corax is such a bad pun for existing. His entire legion being named after birds, his different ranks being named after birds, and just his name meaning raven. It's not the worst. We still have the Iron Mans with his iron hands, but, you know, whatever.